All right, Lone Star Gunners, welcome to the podcast. This is Lone Star Gun Talk, the official podcast of Lone Star Gun Rights, and I am your host, as always, Derek Wills. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Go ahead and chime on in comments where you are watching from. We got a lot of really good information to talk about today. Obviously, this past Monday, there was the big rally in Richmond, Virginia, right outside the Capitol. And there was a lot going on. It was a spectacle, to be sure. It was something that I wish I could have gone to, but I had other obligations that kept me from it. But we had an individual that I met through a mutual friend who lives in Connecticut. He is a Second Amendment advocate. He is an individual that is very pro-liberty about a myriad of different things, but mainly his drive is the restoration of our natural right to keep and bear arms. His name is JW Walshington, but before I bring him in, I got a quick announcement to make, and that is we have endorsed two people for the Texas legislature. The first is Briscoe Cain. Briscoe lives out in the Deer Park area, House District 128, and he has been in the legislature for a couple of sessions now, and he is a fighter. He really is. He understands the parliamentary procedures. He understands what needs to be done, and he is a fighter, and he is somebody that we truly have respect for. He's one of only a handful of people that were in Austin last session that we actually care about. And he is a good man. And so if you live out in Deer Park, make sure you support Briscoe Cain for the March 3rd GOP primaries. Also, House District 25, which is Speaker Bonin's old stomping ground until he got caught in a bribery scandal and decided that, you know what, I'm just not going to seek re-election. We're endorsing Rhonda Seth in that district. That race has gotten really crowded once Speaker Bonin announced that he was not seeking re-election. But Rhonda was the first person to get her skin in the game before that whole scandal broke. She was a fighter from the moment she entered the race, knowing that she was going up against the third most powerful man in the state of Texas. And she has never held a political office before. She has never ran for political office before. She is a registered nurse by trade, and her whole reason for jumping into that race was because of how Dennis Bonin treated constitutional carry and gun rights advocates last session, how he lied about Chris McNutt of Texas gun rights, how he continued to spread misinformation about what the bill did, how he appointed Pancho Navarez to lead the committee that would determine the fate of the most pro-gun piece of legislation that we could offer in the state of Texas. That was why she got in the race. That is why she is continuing to run an awesome campaign, and we are proud to endorse her as well. So if you live in the Lake Jackson-Angleton area, make sure that you are supporting Rhonda Seth. She is the real deal. That I assure you. Okay, so I'm going to bring in JW Walshington here. JW is a wonderful guy. The first time that I spoke with him, we ended up talking on the phone for probably 45 minutes about politics, philosophy, gun rights, you name it. It was kind of touched on at least a little bit. JW, welcome to the podcast, sir.
Hey, Derek. Good to see you again. Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate of course, it. Man. No, it's my pleasure, man. I have to say, JW, you're from Connecticut,
yes,
right? All right, very small state, very, very anti-liberty at the moment, in a myriad of different ways, but particularly whenever it comes to gun rights. Now I know that we're a Texas-based organization, but I'm curious, what is the state of Connecticut like for somebody such as yourself?
Oh, in so many words, we have the constitutional state printed on our license plate, but we're anything but. You know, it's so ironic that you know, Connecticut is somewhat of the cradle of where a lot of you know, pro liberty, you know, founding fathers have come and gone, and you know, unfortunately, it's gone is definitely the word nowadays. It seems like freedoms and liberty are a thing of the past, and it's hard going here, and you know, we're working really hard. We're definitely outgunned, no pun intended, but we do realize that if we can't stop you know, the laws in states like Connecticut, they will spread. So that's our mission, is to try to, you know, work with other, you know, gun owners, and try to make sure that we're at least doing our part and staying on top of it, even if it's a broken system for us right now.
Right on. So checking out in the comments, we got Thomas from the People's Republic of Austin. We got Della from Tennessee. Jeffrey from Moody, Texas. We got another Jeffrey from Behind Enemy Lines in Massachusetts. Oh my God, Jeffrey.
Oh, I feel for you, Jeff.
We also got Walt in. He tagged your page. Apparently he's a friend of yours.
Yeah, Walt's a good guy. He's with the CCDL, and we're the largest grassroots gun organization in Connecticut. So shout out CCDL. We're doing fantastic work, and you know, thanks, Walt. Appreciate you.
Well, cool, guys. If you guys have any questions or comments for JW, please put them in the comments, and I'll relay them to him. So, JW, you went to the rally in Richmond.
Yes.
From all of the pictures and videos that I saw, it looked like it was electrifying. It looked like it was awe-inspiring. What was it like being on the ground in Virginia?
Yeah, great question, Derek. For sure. I mean, it was. I mean, for me, I'm going to be honest. I think for me, it was a little bit different than how other people might have seen it. I totally thought that it was going to be a historical day, and expectations were not. You know, it was right on par with what I was thinking it would be in a lot of ways. And the thing about it is, Derek, for me, and I'm sure you not being there could bring testament to it. It's like, you know, when we have these things and we can't make them, you know, usually people fall into one or two categories on it. It's like they really want to go but can't, and that's understandable because of time, travel distance, you name it. But then there's the other section of people who don't want to go because they feel like it's a waste of time. And I got to tell you, once and for all, it was not a waste of time to show up in Virginia. And, you know, if you're one of those people, not you in particular, Derek, but if you see one of those people out there who are just like, you know, it's a waste of time to go do stuff like this, I highly would recommend that people put more effort into showing up at these sort of rallies, because they do send a very clear message. And I was definitely happy to be part of that.
Absolutely. We got Matthew in. Matthew is actually the mutual friend that connected JW and myself. Matt, I'm glad to see you in here, man.
Thanks, Matt.
No, this a big thank you goes to Matthew Hooks. He hooked this whole thing up, and without him, that it would not have it wouldn't have gone the way that we wouldn't have been able to help bring real news as to what's happening down there to each and everybody. We would have had to have relied on second and third hand sources. So you know, it was important, and you know, JW, I appreciate you being down there, you know, and helping us get all the information out. It really means a lot.
Yep.
So here's the thing. We get you live in Connecticut. It's a very heavily blue state. Virginia used to be kind of a red state, then went kind of purple, and now a lot of people say that it's pretty solid blue. And people think that, oh, that'll never happen here in Texas. I mean, we're Texas, by God. We are the Republic of Texas. We fly our flag at the same height as the U.S. flag. Damn it, it's not going to happen here. But that is not the mentality to have. If it can happen in California, which was heavily red just a few decades ago.
Yeah.
And not to mention, Texas was heavily blue just a few decades ago. These political shifts happen all the time. Now, there has been a push to try and turn Texas blue. Now, my problem with that is that I contend that Texas is already blue. They just all happen to have R's next to their name for the most part. And that seems to be a huge issue. What would you tell Texans as it relates to their rights and how to be wary of their government and why they should be wary of their government and not take for granted the fact that the legislature and the governor's mansion are controlled by Republicans?
Oh man, that's a great question. It's a powerful one too, because in my mind, I think that people are so quick to believe things like NATO is going to come and disarm, the entire United States without even seeing a full standing army from NATO or the UN here to do it. But they're reluctant to believe that, something very realistic like a flip of Democrats or Republicans can happen. And I think even worse is when you see, like you had said, a Republican who you think you like, you trust, and you ask them, hey, what's your stance on the Second Amendment? And they go, I support the Second Amendment. And then they turn right around and they basically go totally against your interpretation of what the Second Amendment means. And usually that follows a line of shall not be infringed, and they go and infringe on it. So I think that people are very, very quick to believe things that, are a lot more of a stretch than to believe that their political landscape will shift. And I'm telling you, it doesn't happen. Sometimes it actually really does happen overnight. I mean, we saw the New York SAFE Act. So I lived in Catskill area of New York. We went through the New York SAFE Act in 2013. That literally got pushed through in the dead of night.
Wow.
So, I was an EMT up there, Catskill ambulance. I was doing my shift. Next morning, woke up, boom, New York SAFE Act is passed. And
Wow.
overnight, I and a lot of the people I worked with, we became felons. And, that was my first taste of, holy cow, this can happen here. It's going to happen anywhere. And, it's not just, the Chuck Schumers and the Andrew Cuomos of the world who are pushing this stuff. It's insidious stuff. And, a guy like Beto O'Rourke in Texas, he came up to Sandy Hook, which is where my cousins went to school. My cousins were in the school at Sandy Hook. So that was a 25-minute drive for me. So I saw Beto and, held a sign up that said, Beto wants our guns, but can't take the truth. And, that's for me to see that guy from Texas in Sandy Hook. It just goes to show you that, in the world of 2020, ideology spreads. We live in a generation of smartphones and stupid people. And, bad information gets from one end to the other, from Texas to Connecticut. Idiots will think the same way idiots think. And we're fighting as Americans. It's not just state by state at this point. It's pro-liberty versus, anti-fact. That's how I see it.
Right. So Mike brought up an interesting comment. He said that he was glad to see the diversity in the crowd, and he thinks that it opened a lot of eyes. And I would agree, because when most people think guns, gun rights, they think straight old white guy, basically. How diverse was the crowd there? I mean, you were there. So what was the diversity like there?
Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think we're in trouble. There was a lot of great photo ops for people to show that there was women and, other people besides, straight white guys. But I would say at least, 60 to 75% was, guys like me and older, and that's got to change. And I think we're starting to see that pendulum shift. And that's really for the better because, you got guys like Maj Touré out there. The real NOC, these guys who are pushing this pro-liberty, very libertarian, version of, let's educate everybody because these are everyone's rights. We need to do a much better job in the Second Amendment community of bringing together people because, and Derek, you and I were talking about this on the phone. it's my experience and yours as well. It sounded like that a lot of us conservatives are very much like, leave us alone, leave us alone. We don't want to engage people. We just want to be left alone. But we have to take that torch up and start engaging people that we usually wouldn't engage with, because people have to realize that these rights are everybody's. They're not just the conservatives. They're not just for any one particular class, creed, or ethnicity. They're everyone's. So I think there's definitely room for improvement, but it was very refreshing to see, not just people there, but also the reaction of people online embracing the fact that there were other people there. But definitely room for improvement there.
Yeah. No, there does seem to be there seems to be kind of I guess, for a lack of a better phrase, a lack of diversity whenever it comes to gun rights and Second Amendment advocacy. And that's not to say that we want diversity for the sake of diversity, because that's asinine. But the thing is, liberty is for everybody. The right to bear arms is a natural right, regardless of your race, sex, creed, sexual orientation, whatever. It really is for everybody. I remember after the Pulse nightclub shooting, a lot of people were trying to do some outreach to the LGBT community, saying, hey, guys, look, this is something that is for y'all as well. And they were always also sharing a lot of articles and press that said that a lot of people in the LGBT community were arming themselves and getting training, and everybody was like, yeah, this is great. And we all agree that that's great, but I think we do need to do a little bit more outreach and just show that we're welcome. We're not going to like shame anybody or harass anybody or
Absolutely.
Or put them down, not cast judgment on anybody.
Right.
Most people don't care if somebody else is gay. Most people don't care if somebody else is black or Asian or a woman or you name it. Most people don't care, because most people understand that people are people, and that's all that there is to it. But we kind of seem to isolate ourselves whenever it comes to a lot of this, and because of that kind of means that we have to do a little bit of outreach and reach into the
places we typically wouldn't.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll tell you something really quickly that a lot of your viewers might find interesting. So I'm hardcore, Second Amendment, pro guns, pro liberty, pro natural rights is the word that you use, and I love that term, because it's innately everyone's right that we have these freedoms, and so we're talking about the LGBTQ community and how we can impact them. So my stepfather, who actually raised me, who taught me how to shoot guns, is now identifies as a woman, and was a man most of my natural life. And so, for me to see that, there are people out there who are in that community who are interested in it, but just feel neglected. I think that's definitely, an opportunity. And a lot of people would be like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, gee, that's really cool. But you know what, when the rubber hits the road and it's your family member or something like that, it, kind of opens your eyes to, wow, these are natural rights. And, the only caveat to that, and I think it's an important distinction, is if somebody's just so far out there, and I mean, you see it, just turn on the news, that they're so mentally incapable of discerning reality to own some of these things, that then we get into a different category altogether. But I think as long as somebody's mentally sane, in 2020's definition of the word, these rights do belong to everybody. And that was something I did see a couple signs for at the rally and was really refreshing.
That's awesome. Now you were on a bullhorn. You were yelling and screaming. You were out there, man. What was the interaction like whenever it wasn't so front and center? Like, did you go up and talk to cops? Did you go up and talk to like people that didn't seem to be part of the crowd? They were just, I don't know, maybe going to this particular store to get whatever, or this shop to get a slice of pizza or whatever. Did you happen to interact with anybody that wasn't part of the rally crowd?
No, and that was a beautiful thing. I mean, it was that was one of the best things in my mind was it was just total freedom everywhere you looked. Like there was you just couldn't run into somebody by accident who didn't mean to be there because it was such a large crowd, and that was really refreshing to me because it was everything I hoped it would be. You know, we got there hours early, and the crowd hadn't even hit its apex at that point, but it was still like, I mean, it was like a Metallica concert is how I would describe it, except for freedom.
So Matt, our good friend Matt, he brings up a good point. He says, "Shall not be infringed." It doesn't say may be infringed or could be infringed. We must bring all Americans, and that's in caps, all Americans together under the real meanings of the Bill of Rights. Rights are misconstrued to politicians and certain uneducated people as privileges. Now, to that, and this is what I want your thoughts on, JW. To that, I would say it doesn't matter what the Second Amendment says. It doesn't matter if the Second Amendment is even there. It doesn't matter if the Second Amendment actually says that only the government has the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms is inherent to us as human beings. It is natural. Therefore, the Constitution doesn't grant it. Its whole purpose in the Second Amendment is to prevent the government from infringing on something that they didn't grant to begin with.
Dude, you just became a constitutional Super Saiyan. Like you just went from like you are glowing Constitution right now, like because you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Oh, okay, well, cool. Now, of course, a lot of people they think that they will support. They will say, and you alluded to this earlier. They support the Second Amendment. And then they follow it with a nice 3-letter word that simply means everything I just said is a lie. But I support the right to bear arms. But I think this. And typically it's something along the lines of, but I think that we should have background checks. But I think that if you're a convicted felon, you shouldn't have the legal authority or legal right to possess a firearm. Or, but I think that but I think that you shouldn't be allowed to own full auto weapons. Or, but I don't think that you should be allowed to own explosives or rocket launchers or nukes or an F-35. I support this 2A, but
right.
What is your take on that, JW?
Oh man. All right. So look, first off, whoever I was talking to who said that, I would immediately just say, look, I can appreciate that. I mean, you could say I can appreciate that in every conversation because it takes out the idea that I'm just going to come in and bulldoze whatever they just said, because that's what I'm going to do ultimately. But I want them to let them know that I've heard them, because I used to actually think like this in some ways. And I think that people are very, quick to, especially in the Second Amendment community, like the second you deviate just 1 degree from the general norm, everybody just, says, forget you. Well, I try to talk to these people and educate them. And I think that, when somebody says I support the Second Amendment and then the but comes in, I always try to establish, like, who am I talking to? Is this somebody who's clearly has no interpretation of what the Second Amendment means, or do they really understand about 80% of it, and then they just think that background checks are the way? And that would differentiate how I handle somebody like that. But really, I think that, like you said, these rights, they're not governed by law. They're not governed by the Constitution. They're granted by a supreme power who's larger than us. And this whole framework, this whole ideology from Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, that all of this falls together into the idea that, okay, but the second you start to infringe on a right that is inherent, it now is not a right, it's a freedom that's granted by another man over another man, and now it's not a right. So you start, parsing it into places where it's incompatible as a right. Now it's being converted into a freedom, which means someone is willing you to have that right if they choose to. And that's not how this works.
Or as Matt put it, a privilege.
Exactly. Yeah. And people use the terms, freedom and right interchangeably nowadays, and that couldn't be further from the truth.
Correct.
The rights are innate, the freedoms are allowed by other men, and and tyrants, of course, oppose freedom, but what they do more on top of that is they suppress rights, and through taking the freedom.
Yeah. So there's a story that kind of went viral a few months back. It was out of Slidell, Louisiana. There was a man named Hakeem Dumas, and he defended his son from being kidnapped by two men. Apparently, he and his wife or girlfriend got into a really bad argument. He took his son to a friend's house. Well, she hired two guys, or called two friends, something like that, to come and take the child. And Hakeem Dumas pulled a handgun out, and shot both of them. One of them died. The other was injured and tried to escape, and then cops ended up finding him and arresting him. And the sheriff's department said this was a justified shooting. There's no question about it. This is a justified shooting. However, we are arresting Mr. Dumas as well because he is violating two laws. One, he is a felon in possession of a handgun, and two, he's in possession of a handgun with an obliterated serial number. He is facing up to 20 years in prison for defending his son. Now, a lot of people said, well, he clearly was possessing a stolen gun because it didn't have a serial number. It's like, well, if the prohibition against him didn't exist, he would have not had a gun with a filed off serial number. And, a lot of people took that, and the first thing they ask is, what was his prior felony? Because as if that matters. And I would say that it doesn't, because, it turns out that his past felony was drug related. But if he had been convicted of homicide, does he automatically then lose his right to defend his son from being kidnapped? What do you think?
All right. So look, first off, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. But
right.
There's a difference between, so for instance, this was a justifiable homicide. So you could look back into someone's record and say, okay, he's got a homicide record. But look, I don't think so when it comes to rights, everybody has the right to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So to take someone else's life away, it's always a very, there's a lot of gravity to that, right? So
right.
The circumstances have to be looked at. However, in the case of this gentleman, who I've never heard of, so this is just a hot take. This is coming right off the rip. But I think you bring a valid point. It doesn't matter, okay, if you're in our society, okay, and you are a citizen participating in society, you have the right to defend yourself. Period, bar none, end of story. Government has no right, reason, or rhyme to get involved. So you're right. The fact that the felony limited him from his self-defense by modern means, aka semi-automatic firearm, that if he didn't have those limitations, he wouldn't have a gun with a scratched off serial number, and then he wouldn't have to go to prison. And unfortunately, that is the reality. So he did nothing that I can see as justifiably a reason to lock this man in a cage like a dog. And unfortunately, society has allowed tyranny to exist on many different levels in many different ways. And one of the most dangerous ways we can let tyranny exist is actually on a personal scale. People are very quick to, bitch about tyranny in the government when it exists existentially, but they are very quick to let tyranny exist in their head by, complying with these government rules and these ideologies, and letting that tyrannical thought exist inside them, and then standing up and justifying it. Like, what do you mean? What was his prior felonies? Why did he have a gun? And I think that just comes from ignorance. People just don't really know the true meaning of these laws and how they are, laid out by our founding fathers, and more importantly, where they come from.
Yeah,
I hope that makes sense. I hope I put a bow on that nicely, but
that does make sense. By the way, we got Becky in here from Mississippi, and Taylor brings up a nice point. He says the right to self-defense is, in my opinion, the most important natural right. all animals, man or otherwise, have the right to defend their lives. No one argues against the ram's ability to use his horns against a mountain lion. And that's absolutely true. I mean, now, obviously, if I take a firearm and I shove it in somebody's face for no reason, and then I take their property, or I just decide to squeeze the trigger for fun, no, I don't have the right to do that. But that's an act. You know,
Right.
here's something that drives me up a wall. So a lot of people like to quote the Supreme Court for various things. I never do, unless it's to prove the point that the Supreme Court is a bunch of despotic oligarchs that are unelected and unaccountable, and you know, they aren't transcended into a morally superior form of human being by sitting on a bench. But I digress a bit.
Yeah.
So the Supreme Court said that there's no, and this is something that's been spouted off a lot. Well, you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. Therefore, you don't have an unlimited right to free speech. You can't libel somebody. You can't slander somebody because, well, that means you don't have an unlimited right to speech.
Right.
And I would say that's absolutely wrong, because you do have an unlimited right to speak. You do have an unlimited right to say anything that you want. The right ends the second that you infringe on another human being's liberty. Their right to do the exact same thing you're doing, the second you infringe on that, your right has stopped. It's like I can swing my fists in the air all day, but until I hit you in the nose, you can't stop me from doing that. But once I hit you in the nose, I have crossed the line. Now, the thing is, those are all specific acts. It's not the act of speaking. It's not the act of swinging your fists. When you libel somebody, when you slander somebody, you are making up a lie in public that intentionally defames and degrades their reputation in some way.
Right.
You have therefore infringed on their right, their liberty. When you own a M2 HB 50 cal machine gun, you're possessing it, right? I love the M2. But whenever you own an M2, well, you're not doing anything. Okay, so you own an M1 Abrams. Okay, you're not doing anything. Okay, you're possessing something. Okay, well, right. you own an F-35. Okay, you're not doing anything. So to equate gun control to yelling fire in a crowded theater is not apples to apples. What is apples to apples is libel, slander, yelling fire in a crowded theater, and shooting an unarmed innocent person in the face.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, you just made something pop into my head
what you got?
As you're talking about all this. I think that from now on, I'm going to refer to all my firearms as rented, because I'm going to die someday, you know? So I'm just kind of renting them, you know? I don't own shit anymore, you know? I'm just renting everything from here on out. So, you know, I wonder how they'll look at that. Oh, you can't possess that? Well, maybe he was renting it. You never know.
Jeff asks an interesting question. Didn't not allowing felons to possess firearms come from Jim Crow laws, and was originally racially motivated? Yes and no. It didn't come from.
It was.
It wasn't Jim Crow though. Licensing.
It is racially motivated.
Oh yes, absolutely. No. That's not an opinion. That is factual, man. So permitting the right to, or the licensing of carrying handguns and things like that, that all started with Jim Crow. In fact, if you ever read the Dred Scott v. Sanford, another reason why I don't actually cite the Supreme Court to like hold up my case, because the Supreme Court is an awful organization. They said, oh, no, we can't say that, we can't grant free slave citizenship because that would mean they could bear arms. Right. Also misguided in the fact that it only applies to Americans, but, you know, whatever.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept too. Just because there's an invisible border, you know, doesn't mean that the rights stop. Again, it's not granted by the Constitution. It's everybody. People don't get that.
Right.
Sorry, I didn't mean to disrail you, but that's a huge point.
No. You're absolutely right. Just because a government across those borders doesn't recognize those rights as rights doesn't mean that those rights don't exist there. So if you go to Mexico, for instance,
he preaching.
Yeah. When you go to Mexico, for instance, and you can't legally, quote unquote, own a firearm, that doesn't mean you don't have the right to bear arms. It means the government doesn't recognize it.
Correct.
If you go to 1940s Germany, you wouldn't say that the Jews didn't have a right to life because their government decided to strip it away from them and execute them in gas chambers. You'd say that the government was infringing upon their natural right to life. So any other government, including our own, that doesn't fully recognize the natural right to bear arms as a natural right, it's not that you don't have that right, it's that they don't acknowledge it as such. And that's the very definition of tyranny.
He testifying.
Oh, man, I got the Holy Spirit in me right now.
I got the Holy Spirit. Come to the front of the congregation, my brother, and say it again for the back people. Tell them in the back. Tell all of them.
Oh, man. So back to oh God, where was I? Back to Jeff's question.
Having freedom is where we were.
Yeah. Back to Jeff's question. The felon part came about in 1968 with the Gun Control Act. Now, I don't have to tell y'all about the disparities between the races whenever it comes to the commission of crime, sentencing, all of that fun stuff. There is a disproportional amount of blacks that commit, how do I say this? Whenever it comes to the commission of crimes, there is a disproportionate amount committed by people of color. That's not to say that they are inherently evil. Okay,
right.
Man, I'm about to get banned by Facebook again. I promise. But the reason, because of that fact, the Congress pushed the Gun Control Act of '68 to include felons because of the fact that most felons were people of color, and it's an egregious racial injustice. It's something that is just entirely wrong in this country.
Right.
Of course, they wanted to also save face, so they said, dishonorably discharged from the military, and if you've ever been in a mental health institution, or if you ever beat your wife, then domestic violence, then no. And the thing is, like, it upsets me so much because of the fact that people still support it, not because of the racial overtones that pushed that into law, but because it still sounds good. Oh man, I don't want a violent felon to be able to possess a gun.
Right.
It's like, that doesn't matter.
Right.
If you give the government the authority to define who can and cannot exercise a right, it ceases to be a right and becomes a privilege. And that group that they have isolated as being unable to exercise that right, just because you're not part of it now doesn't mean that the government won't ever include you in the future.
Right. As soon as you start to segregate out certain sections of people, you get in a very, very dicey territory. That was something you and I were talking about on our phone call, which was a great phone call. But we spent a long time talking about. So your point is, if you give a violent felon a gun. So as a Second Amendment advocate, I spent a lot of my time advocating for, look, it's not the law-abiding gun owners like you and I who are having issues with guns. It's people who should never have guns, to begin with, who are, either mentally, incapable of responsible firearms ownership. That I don't think can be argued. There is a certain degree of mental culpability that a responsible gun owner has to adhere to. And then the other thing is, there are certain people who are, regardless of their right, I think their standing in society leans them to be more, inept or adapt to be violent with firearms, or more callous towards certain humans and their life and their rights. And so we were talking about, well, where's the government's position in rehabilitating these people? And, once you start to take a look at our rehabilitation process in America, as far as here, we're just going to lock you in a cage and throw away the key and you better learn your lesson. is that even an effective way of punishment? And if so, I mean, are we ready to incorporate those individuals who we're inflicting punishment upon? Are we going to incorporate them back into society? And if so, should they have all their rights? The answer is, if their punishment works correctly, meaning that person has reached their rehabilitation, then yes, they should get their rights back. But what do we do with people who don't reach rehabilitation, or since the system is ineffective, what do you think we should do with those people, Derek? Because I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
So you first need to really identify, is incarceration supposed to be punitive or rehabilitative? And that's an important question to ask, because if it's punitive, then, well, why have any sentencing guidelines at all? Once you get sentenced to prison, why not just have life for everybody?
Right.
If it's rehabilitative, then that means that somebody learns from their past transgressions, that they evolve and they grow, and then they can be reintroduced back into society. So it's an important question that needs to be asked. Now, the biggest problem with our legal system, and I refuse to call it a justice system because that implies a semblance of justice that exists, but the biggest problem is that we make everybody a felon. I mean, Martha Stewart is a felon right now.
Yeah.
Why?
Because of money.
Right, because of money. Most people get felonies because of drugs. And, I'm going to have to shamelessly plug myself here. So I'm in the process of writing a book, everybody, in case I haven't told you enough. And right now I'm working on the chapter on justice. And it's like, how do you define justice, for one? And where should the laws be tailored towards? Well, if liberty is your ultimate goal, if a society in liberty is what you are striving for, then you can't have any law whatsoever that doesn't have a victim. You can't have any act that is illegal if it doesn't have a victim associated with it. And society can't be a victim, okay? Society is, one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. But so then once you kind of define that, okay, all of our crimes require a victim. Well, now is it punitive or is it rehabilitative? Because if it's punitive, well, how do you deal with that? What is the purpose of justice? Justice is to make whole somebody who is wronged, somebody whose liberty was. Go ahead.
Well, I think the goal of justice, because you had asked me this question, and I had a lot of time to ponder it, and I'm still having trouble with it. And the reason I'm having trouble with it, I've at least been able to pin down why it's such a hard question, which is sometimes half the fight. But you see, it's not about making someone whole. It's not about that at all. It's about the perception of making someone whole, because you look at, like, let's take a murder, for instance. They say, well, they'll gather around the microphones and say, well, justice was really served today. The criminal is behind bars. Look, the victim was never made whole. It's just the social perception of justice has been administered. And I think that's why the context of it is so important. And the question is a great one. And so I even, dug it a little bit deeper, because I'm a Freemason, right? So, we believe that, there is a greater power. It doesn't matter what you call it or how you worship. But, for me, when I think of, the Bible is what I read, and it says, only God can judge. And this makes it so clear to me, because only those who judge can truly give justice. And it's only through that perception. And what greater perception to dispense justice than divine perception? Because I clearly think in some cases it's like there's some people who you'll come across, and they're so unreasonable that if you hit their car, they'll shoot you. And now that becomes a crime in and of itself. But in their mind, they were getting justice for you backing into their brand new Mercedes-Benz. So people are very, their perceptions of justice can be wide ranging. So to me, that's why it's so hard to define, because it's a very, moldable and movable landscape when it comes to what is actually true justice. And the answer is, who knows? It's it's such a very tough thing to define, because I think the definition changes with each case and with each person.
So, you're not wrong. There is, though, you brought up a valid point, and it was more of a misspeak for me. Justice's attempt is to make somebody whole again. If you take something like theft, it's easy to make somebody whole. If they
stole
stole
$5, here's $5. Yeah,
right,
you're done.
Right. And
cut and dry.
If you want to put some punitive damages on that, then that's a different discussion, for the time and the headache and all of that. But that's an easy thing to put a value on, But whenever, as you brought up, whenever it comes to homicide, whenever it comes to murder, whenever it comes to rape and all of these egregious crimes, you can't ever make somebody whole again. But
Right.
you can do your best. Now, putting somebody in prison, I would argue that if you are entirely rooted in liberty, and the only crimes require a victim, then the most egregious rape, murder, all of those types of egregious crimes that really violate somebody's liberty, then yes, prison is a suitable punitive punishment for them, because of the fact that what is a prison? A prison is effectively a complete and separate society removed from the rest of society. So
Right.
it's effectively an exile. And I think that is something that could be punitive and valid, and the only variable depends on the length of exile that you are sentencing them to. So whenever it comes to dealing with people that have committed egregious crimes, every crime is different, and therefore having these mandatory minimums or maximum penalties, that's something that really should be left up to the people hearing the facts of the case, as to what really would make justice be served the best that it can be.
Yeah.
Now, if you're looking at a murder, then it's easy to say, oh, we'll lock him up for life. But is it really that easy? Because the semantics around it really matter.
Yeah.
So if somebody commits a murder, and I hate this phrase because it really is just an excuse, but in the heat of passion, quote unquote, even though I hate that phrase, that is a completely different set of circumstances than somebody who
planned
for months to murder somebody.
Right. Different mind frames for sure.
Yeah, so if somebody was put into exile or into prison, there is a means by which I think that they should be allowed to return back to society. The problem is the overwhelming majority of felons in this country are nonviolent. And that's a problem, because that means no victim was ever present in the commission of that crime.
Right. And statistically speaking, I mean, our government has gone so out of control that, and I read a statistic that's been very well documented, that the average person commits, up to 3 felonies per day and doesn't even realize they're in commission of a felony. So you get a lot of people who say, oh, well, that person shouldn't have a firearm because they're a felon. No. All it is they got caught. You have committed many felonies. And even if you don't want to believe the daily statistic, let's go with yearly or monthly. People will commit felonies during their lifetime. No question about it. The laws are just so numerous that it's impossible not to run afoul of our lawful, system. But it doesn't mean that these things, most people, I think, are moral creatures. So they wouldn't, purposefully, do a lot of immoral things. It's just that, the law is sometimes so wide reaching that, a lot of innocent people can be swept up in the net. And then when it comes time for them to seek their rights, the government says, too bad, so sad. And I think that's really for me, that's really the one that I'm pulling for. I feel like everybody deserves a second chance or a third chance, but it does come to a point where you have to realize, like you said, are we rehabilitating people, or is the punishment punitive? And I think it's a little of both. But
Yeah.
the definition of justice is, to me, it always implies there's a certain degree of imperfection, because we're human.
Right. No, absolutely.
We're imperfect creatures.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, man. We got way off on a tangent because we were supposed to talk about Virginia. We were supposed to talk about Virginia. But so let's try and get back on course with Virginia. And I'm not going to spend too much longer because we've already been live for 51 minutes. So we need to,
people asleep out there? Are people still in the comments?
Yeah. There are people still in the comments. Now, shortly after the rally, the governor of Virginia, the Virginia Assembly passed a red flag law and a couple other things. Do you
one handgun per month?
Red
flag law, bunch of stupid stuff.
Yeah. Do you think that the rally was a waste of time?
No.
Okay. Why?
Do you think so?
I do not. I agree with you, but I'm curious as to why you think that it was not.
Well, I'll tell you what. Yes, they railroaded the proposals through, and they're well on their way to actually becoming law. But here's why I don't think it was a waste of time. History has a funny way of working, right? So when you're in the moment where history is being made, it's very difficult to anticipate the outcome, because we had 8 hours drive to talk about this. Hey, do you think this is going to be a waste of time? And I said, no. And they said, well, what makes you think that? And I said, look, it's always very difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, but you always have to think of perception. Okay. The way that this is going to be looked at 20, 30, 40, even 2-3 years from now, we have to do our best to play in what is absolutely a broken system. And historical context to that is, if you look at the story of Marvin Heermeyer, Marvin did everything he possibly could. I'll just give you a real quick synopsis, but the man owned a muffler business. The town said that, you got to shut your business down. They essentially ruled his entrance and exit as, the land for a concrete facility. They took the entrance to his shop away, ruined this guy financially, and he did everything he could. He went to town halls, he wrote his legislation, he did everything he could to try to fight against the broken system, until it got pushed too far, and he knew that there was no coming back from it. And we're not there yet. We're not there yet in the Second Amendment fight. People feel like we are, because we're in a generation where people think that our government works like Amazon Prime, where you put your order in 2 days, it shows up at the front door. Our government's not Amazon Prime, okay? We've been fighting in its current iteration of gun control. We've been fighting it since the 60s, and we've been winning for the last, 40 years. But the thing is, we haven't gotten to the point where push has really come to shove. It's just that the meter is starting to flow into their favor instead of into ours. And now the real fight is actually starting. That's only for the last 10 years or so. And so, when people are sick and tired of fighting, that's how you need to still keep going, because that's how the real fight's actually just getting started. You look at how the Boston Massacre started. It was the perception of the Boston Massacre that started to actually change people's minds. It's the Lavoy Finicums of the world that are going to start to change people's minds. And if you look, Ammon Bundy won his case. Lavoy Finicum died. Awful, awful situation. But the perception of how that went down, there's no denying the FBI was wrong. Just like there's no denying Waco was an atrocity by the FBI. Ruby Ridge, same thing. But in the moment, oh my God, people were, out there going crazy against, think of Waco. They were a bunch of crazies. I kind of grew up, I was very, very young, but I can remember my father talking about it. And, the conception was that they were in Waco, they were a bunch of religious zealots. The conception in Ruby Ridge was this guy was a right-wing extremist. They're doing the same stuff, but it's all about how it gets perceived 20, 30 years from now. And if we do our best to be like Marvin and play in the broken system, when history comes full circle, they'll see that we were right, and we might even win. Even if we lose, win, or draw, we have to do it the correct way. Because remember, even our founding fathers could have been looked at as terrorists. It's just the fact that they won the fight. But we have to play smart, and we have to do things like Virginia and show our voice and not be afraid and not make excuses. Sorry, I've got a dog petting competition I have to go to. I'm not going to make a rally. There's some people, like I said, financially, distance, time, work. I get it. There's always going to be something. But when it's in your hometown, you better make sure you're there. And I'm sure you will, Derek. I know you're going to be the first guy out there, and you've even put on some of this stuff, which I think, that's a huge, a great thing for your area, the fact that you're out there advocating so hard. But for those of you who aren't Derek, who are listening to this and who hear these same tired excuses come up in their friends or at their shooting ranges, you have to remind people, look, we all get the same 24 hours in a day. It's all how we allocate it. And
absolutely.
We better start making the Second Amendment and our natural rights higher and higher on that list, or we'll lose them.
Yeah. And here I thought I was going to get through an entire show without the mention of Waco or Ruby Ridge, because those are like my buttons. So thanks, I appreciate it.
Had to do it.
No, I know. But no, you're absolutely right. And guys, listen up. For everybody that is here in Texas, I know that we do have a lot of listeners outside of Texas, but everybody here in Texas, guys, there is a gun control push right now by a Republican, by arguably the most powerful man in Texas, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. He has been pushing universal background checks since Midland, Odessa. And his whole thing is that we should not be having stranger-to-stranger sales. And I'll tell you, guys, if he wants that and we do nothing, he will get that. And that will become law here in Texas. Now, I know that there's a lot of concern as to what we can do about this. Well, unfortunately, he's not up for re-election until 2022, and the next legislative session is 2021. We have a postcard campaign going on right now for $5. We've got over 1,000 of these printed up. For $5, we'll sign your name to it, and we're going to mail all of them at the same time to his office, because that is going to be the beginning of sending him a crystal clear message. What happened in Richmond needs to happen everywhere. But here in Texas, we need to send him a very crystal clear message now. And then once session goes, then we can start getting boots on the ground. But we need to let him know that he is on the wrong track, and he is pushing something that we will not tolerate. Keep in mind, we still don't have constitutional carry in this state, guys. He is the president of the Senate. He is the senior most person in the Senate, and he decides what pieces of legislation move forward. If we get a vote in the House, he could kill it in the Senate. We need to tell him that will not be tolerated. So there's a link in the show notes to have us send him a postcard on your behalf. And I will post up pictures as soon as I mail all of them out. Thinking the end of February is when I will do that. Anyway, that's how it starts, guys. That's how it starts.
And also one more quick point. I mean, I'm 29 years old, so I was alive when the Clintons' assault weapons ban was in full swing. And guys, in our lifetimes, we can remember not being able to go to the store and buy a brand new AR-15 off the shelf. Everything was pre-ban, but there was that weird gray area where you just saw pretty much brand new rifles, 93, 94, 95. They just got more expensive, but there was plenty of them out there. Well, when the assault weapons ban sunsetted and all of that stuff got lifted, I mean, look, Texas was affected by that. If it could happen on a federal level, you'd be crazy to think it won't happen on the state level. They're pushing harder now than ever to get it to come to where people think they were safe before, state by state. It's going to happen. And it has happened federally in our lifetime. So don't be foolish. Don't be foolish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Anyway, JW, we could continue this conversation for another hour if we wanted to, but I think we should wrap things up. But before we do that, I want to give you the floor. If there's anything that you want to say, you got your own social media page, right?
I do. Yeah, you guys can go check me out at JW Second Amendment Advocate on Facebook. Also JW2A on Instagram. Yeah, anywhere you see people trying to fight for their rights, hopefully you'll find me. I try to prioritize all this stuff pretty heavily. So glad to have you guys following the page, and thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Well, man, I appreciate you coming on. If you ever want to come on again, all you got to do is let me know, man. I appreciate you being here very much.
You got it. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
Jefferson's my spirit animal.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, that is going to do it for me. JW, thank you again for being here. Again, guys, make sure you check out that postcard campaign. It's really important. Also, if you live in House District 128, vote for Briscoe Cain for the GOP primaries. If you live in House District 25, support Rhonda Seth. She is going to do a lot of wonderful things, even as a freshman. It's going to be awesome. I know next Sunday is the Super Bowl, but I'm going to be here. I hope to see you then. So next Sunday, arm yourself with knowledge and share the ammo.